Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, and today's founder is Jeremiah Van Rensselaer, an inaugural member of the United States House of Representatives. Now, Jeremiah Van Rensselaer was from Albany, New York, and as his last name indicates, he was a member of the Rensselaer family, which was one of the wealthiest families in all of the colonial state and would be a wealthy family in the young United States a few years hence. It was in this situation that Van Rensselaer decided to join a few ragtag people in Albany and sign what's known as the Albany Constitution. Now, this is not to be confused with the governmental constitution. This constitution should better be described as resolutions. At the time leading up to the Revolutionary War, many grievances were had by the different towns, and each different town or city would have members come together and sign grievances, usually called resolutions. But in Albany, they called it a constitution. And one of the reasons for that is it did organize the Albany Sons of Liberty. Yes, Boston is not the only city that had a Sons of Liberty. Many cities had Sons of Liberties, including Albany. And Jeremiah Van Rensselaer was one of the people who founded his. And he's a very important person because of that, because his name carried so much wealth behind it, both literally and figuratively. The Rensselaers owned all the land around the city of Albany. As I've said many times, New York, before, during, and after the American Revolution, was a feudal system where a few wealthy people owned all the land and they leased it out to tenants who worked the property and then would pay some extra to the owners. Now, Jeremiah was not the Lord of Rensselaer Manor, but he was a Rensselaer nonetheless. So he joining the Sons of Liberty was a really big deal. He ends up joining the Committee of Safety, which organized the militia to prepare for a war that might happen, and he became president of the Committee of Correspondence, which was in charge of communicating with all the other towns, cities, and colonies leading up to and during the Revolutionary War. Once the war breaks out, Rensselaer is actually brought into the Continental Army and he serves for several years as paymaster. Now, this was a difficult job because there wasn't any money to pay people with, but Rensselaer did his best, I assure you. After the war ends is really when he starts to make his mark. Jeremiah has made a name for himself at this point. He's elected to the New York State Assembly, where he serves for several years, before being elected to the inaugural House of Representatives. He is an inaugural member of the United States government, and he sits in Congress. Now, while he's there, there's one really interesting thing that happens to him. You see, while he's in Congress, he's there for several sessions, and the French Revolution breaks out, and certain wealthy French people don't want to get their heads cut off, so they want to move to America. They do this through intermediaries. Thomas Jefferson, of course, has come back to the United States by that point to serve as Secretary of State, but one of his proteges who's not spoken about enough is William Short, who stays behind and is kind of running things behind the scenes unofficially for the Americans in Europe. And Short ends up sending Louis Osmont, although it's French, so it might be Louis Osmont. Louis Osmont comes across to the United States, and he had purchased some French. He had purchased some land through William Short and a few other intermediaries in central New York. Unfortunately, as soon as he arrives, it's just about the time Timothy Pickering works out a treaty with the Iroquois in upstate New York, and some of the land has been given to the United States, but some of the land has not. Unfortunately for Louis Osmont, his land is now Iroquois territory, and they talk to Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, appoint Van Rensselaer as the one who's supposed to resolve this issue. Now, very unfortunately, basically Van Rensselaer has to go try and buy the land from the Iroquois. They don't want to sell it. You might realize that the Iroquois just lost a ton of their land after the American Revolutionary War. They don't want to lose any more, especially to some French guy who really has nothing to do with them at all. So, bummer for Louis Osmont. Bummer for Van Rensselaer, but don't worry about it too much. Louis Osmont ends up going to Philadelphia, where he starts a merchant firm and ends up becoming very wealthy. He was a wealthy Frenchman. He brought a bunch of money over and kept being very wealthy in Philadelphia. But I just found that whole scenario fascinating, and I definitely wanted to share it with you. As for Van Rensselaer, after his time in office, he goes back to New York, and he starts the Bank of Albany. Now, the Bank of Albany is currently defunct. It did not last until modern day, but after the Revolutionary War, after the Constitution was ratified very particularly, you see banks popping up across the United States, and Albany was no different. And Van Rensselaer starts the Bank of Albany, which really helped build the financial wherewithal for Albany to be a major city coming into the 19th century and into the 20th century, I should say, even. Unfortunately, Albany's not the mammoth city it once was. It used to be a very important city in the United States. Now it's basically just the corrupt capital of New York. But for the first half of American history, Albany was a very populated and influential city. And a large part of that, well, it was already like that when the colonies became states, but even more so after Van Rensselaer founded the Bank of Albany. Now, riding on this wave of success, Governor George Clinton decides to, well, run for office again. He was going to be governor more because George Clinton was always governor of New York, except a brief little bit where John Jay was. That being said, he needed a new running mate, and he chose Jeremiah Van Rensselaer to run alongside George Clinton always won almost all of his campaigns for governor, and so Rensselaer signing on as lieutenant governor with George Clinton was a great idea because they won together, and Van Rensselaer became lieutenant governor of New York State for 4 years. After that, George Clinton became vice president of the United States and therefore did not run again. And Jeremiah Van Rensselaer, at this point, again, super wealthy, decides to retire to private life. So that is the story of Jeremiah Van Rensselaer, a very interesting American founder, one of the side members of the Van Rensselaer family, of which there are many. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, remember to hit like. That's the best thing you could do for me. And if you're new here, subscribe. I put out videos about a different founder every morning, and we do some fun stuff at night too. So make sure you subscribe. I'm Jason, and I'll be back with another founder for you tomorrow.